So I've been reading a few books over the past couple of months or so and wanted to do a review of some of them. One of the books I've read but won't be reviewing in this video is the excellent historical fiction The Hand of Fatima, which details an excruciatingly painful story of a man's life and love torn apart during the Spanish Reconquista as he is forcibly converted to Christianity in medieval Spain. Excellent novel. It's a huge work, about 1,000 pages, but absolutely brilliant and really makes you feel the pain of these characters. It's got love, romance, war, trauma, family. It was terrific. I also read Apostate, a really interesting autobiography of Joran van Cleveren, who says he read the Quran looking to write a book disproving it and showcasing that it was a book of hate, only to fall more and more in love with it as he carried on reading and eventually became a Muslim. I also read the classic Slaughterhouse 9, biographies on Aurangzeb, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, John Mann's Saladin, which was an electric and riveting work, the thought-provoking Rethinking Islam in the West by Ahmed Paul Kida, the huge Osman's Dream by Caroline Finkel. I finished 2 Asrar Rashid books I hadn't read, Navigating the End of Time and Intellectual Intifada, and an interesting spiritual book called Saracen Chivalry by Zia Inayat Khan, in which a dying queen lays the foundation to being a just ruler in a letter written to her infant son. So the first book on my list is Billy Summers. So this is one of the more recent Stephen King works. I'm a big fan of his books, in particular his vivid writing style. I heard good things about this one. I was intrigued at the idea of reading a King novel completely divorced from sci-fi, plus the idea of reading one of his more modern works, which I hadn't done so. Billy Summers is a crime novel telling the story of a hitman on the dawn of retirement who is offered one last job by Nick, a mobster who Billy worked for many times. He is told to wait out in an office space in a small town where, atypical of King protagonists, his cover story is that he's a writer. But interestingly, Billy does actually start writing his rather interesting backstory, his real backstory, in his novel. Billy suspects Nick will double-cross him leading up to the hit, and later when he is hiding out, he comes across a young woman who is dumped out of a truck half dead, rescuing her and forming a bond. I have to be honest, I had a tough time with this novel. In many ways, it's an inverse of a typical King book. It's rather flat and dull throughout, but gets quite good towards the end, when usually King books are fantastic and have a poor ending. I just found it really boring for the most part. The story takes too long to get going, the waiting, the build up to the hit, all of that, it just meanders until it starts to get interesting, what with the double crossing and whatnot. I can just kind of picture Stephen King in the middle of the pandemic going, you know what, I fancy writing a hitman book. But the thing is, many of the standard one last job tropes are covered. It gives the book a bit of a by the numbers feel. I mean, King isn't afraid of turning a sentence into a paragraph, but usually you're dealing with horrors from your nightmares or science fiction elements. The inner monologues of an aging man trying not to get an erection when a drugged up, battered woman lays in front of him isn't as interesting. There's just so much filler. Him waking up and having coffee, going over to the neighbours for beer, opening a cardboard box. It just goes on and on. I think it would have been more exciting as a tight novella. The next book is Lord of the Flies, which is a classic work written by William Golding telling the story of a plane crash on an uncharted island which sees a group of schoolboys stranded. They celebrate their freedom from adult supervision before their need for food and shelter kicks in. They begin to form ideas on leadership and society. I'm not sure if I would say I enjoyed this book. It certainly was an interesting read. Clearly the author had a cynical outlook on people and wanted to peel away the facade of civilization and show what people are really like when social constructs are done away with and how quickly people can become like animals. I later learned that the book was written as essentially a response to another book, The Coral Island, about some stranded kids or something, and the children all get together in true British spirit and form camaraderie and create a little society. And this book was essentially Golding saying, no, that's not what would happen. This is what would happen. He was a school teacher and was forwarding the idea that if children are left to their own devices, they would not somehow recreate the glory of the British Empire, but instead run amok in savagery. The prose of the book can be a bit dry. Like I said, I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, but I do appreciate it for what it is and what it's trying to say, and it sure has some powerful moments in the narrative. My next book is Ottomans: A Cultural Legacy. I watched a video from the YouTube channel Blogging Theology where he read out a portion of Diana Dark's work about when the Ottomans first encountered coffee. I thought it sounded mildly interesting, and given I was in a period where I was fanatic about all things Ottoman, I bought the book. Honestly, I was pretty much ready for something dry and academic, but I have to say, I had a really good time with this book. It's one of those that makes you sad the closer you get to the end because you know it's almost over. I'd actually go as far as to say this is my favourite book I've read on Ottoman history. Dark focuses on architecture, on buildings, on carpets, on roads, but somehow she tells the story of the empire through these images and passages in a way that is fluid and easily digestible. There are so many great gems in this book, so many amazing tidbits of information. It's all gloriously laid out. Some of the photos, the maps, the paintings and manuscripts acquired are incredible. And Dark has a balanced voice that cuts through prejudice and preconceived notions. I can't recommend this book enough. I really loved it. It's a terrific exploration of Ottoman government, religious values, commerce, education, art, inventions, medicine, including the first vaccines and the cure for smallpox, and music, architecture, and cuisine. I did find one small mistake though, which, not to toot my own horn, but I've noticed is becoming a trend when I read works on the Ottomans. The author mentioned that after the founder of the empire, Osman Ghazi, no Ottoman sultan married until Suleiman the Magnificent, but just a few pages later, she says that Selim the Grim, who was Suleiman's father, married. So which is it? I contacted her about this on Twitter, and she was gracious enough to acknowledge the slip. It was more of a semantic error anyway. All in all, The Ottomans, A Cultural Legacy really surprised me with how engrossing it was. A must-read for Ottoman fanatics. My next book is All the Pieces Matter. As followers of the channel may know, I'm a big fan of the Wire series, and I talk about it a lot on the main channel. I'm a bit wary of literature that accompanies movies and TV shows, but All the Pieces Matter really is an excellent work in which the author conducted extensive interviews with the cast and crew of the show, and the book is essentially a documentation of those interviews combined in a way that is fluid and readable. The access to key players is perhaps unparalleled, and I definitely got some ideas for new videos from this book, like interviews that were done which highlighted how unhappy Idris Elba was to be written off the show, for example. For fans of The Wire who can't get enough of it, I'm sure that they would definitely enjoy picking this work up. One key thing that I really liked about it is that it gave you a good understanding of who did what exactly, between the likes of David Simon and Ed Burns, who came up with the storylines, who wrote the dialogue, that kind of stuff, which gives you a greater appreciation of just how many people were responsible for making this series work. My next book is Greetings from Bury Park. Safraz Mansour is a British journalist and broadcaster who grew up in an area very close to where I grew up. Apparently everybody around me was aware that he had written a famous book. Everybody except me apparently, so I sought it out and gave it a read. Greetings from Bury Park is basically Mansour telling the story of his life, in particular his childhood, growing up as a Pakistani immigrant who moved to the UK with his family at the age of 2. Major themes of the works are identity, growing up, religion, family, manhood, and Mansour's obsession with Bruce Springsteen, which gave him motivation in life. His difficult relationship with his father is a major aspect of the book, as is his thoughts on where he lived. And given I share many of the childhood life experiences Mansour had, I found the book to be really engaging, like it spoke to me directly in places that I could really relate to what he was feeling and thinking in given moments. Plus, while I was reading it, I started to get the feeling that my granddad was talked about in the book. And when I spoke to my mum about it, I realized my family, my parents' generation and their parents' generation, actually knew Mansour's family very well. And it was my grandfather mentioned in the book. And my family shared some stories of their own with me about Mansour that wasn't mentioned in the book, which was interesting. When it gets to Mansour's later life, going to Springsteen concerts and such, it got a little less interesting for me, but all in all, for the relatability, the humour, the readability, I thought Greetings from Bury Park was an excellent autobiographical work. My next book is The Sultan and the Queen. Growing up in the UK and being someone who's very interested in history, in Islam and Islamic history in adulthood, one striking thing that sticks out to me when you combine all four elements is the lack of education regarding Britain's relationship with the Muslim world. You would think the two elements, Britain and Islam, were worlds apart, and the UK only really came into contact with Islam in the 1960s or something, when mass immigration from countries like Pakistan occurred. Not so, however, as England has a fascinating relationship with Islam. The reason why most people aren't aware is a discussion for another day, but one thing that caught my attention was this book by Jerry Broughton, focusing on a fascinating story of the Protestant Queen Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII, ostracized from Catholic Europe, needing allies, who reached out to the Ottoman Empire, in particular the Ottoman Sultan Murad III, the largest Muslim empire at the time and perhaps the world's greatest superpower, as this was the period some years after Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, considered the zenith of Ottoman power. The book chronicles the cordial and friendly back and forth between Elizabeth and Murad, starting with the Ottoman Sultan not really knowing what Britain was. The book goes off into interesting tangents about certain historical figures and stories here and there, like this traveller whose name I forgot, who, if I remember correctly, he met the Shah of Iran, the Grand Turk, Ivan the Terrible, Elizabeth I, and most likely her father too. You could make a great movie about his life, as you could about the Battle of the Three Kings, a fascinating fight between Portugal and Morocco, covered in great detail in the book. The book also delves into how the evolving relationship between Elizabeth and her new friends had significant impact on the arts in England. Shakespeare is covered a lot in the book, how he was influenced by these new exotic Moors that were arriving as emissaries in England and such. It's a good read, some fascinating stuff covered. I do have a few issues with it though. I am a student of Ottoman history, but this book covers the English side more. Nothing too egregious there, it is what it is, but the author makes basic errors and assumptions that I found a little irritating, as if he hadn't done as much homework on basic Ottoman and Islamic elements as much as he did for minute details in Shakespeare's plays. Calling Suleiman the Magnificent the grandson of Mehmed the Conqueror when he was his great-grandson, for example, being one of them. There's also so much focus on Shakespeare and English plays, which started off very interesting, but started to get a little grating when we began extensively analysing verses and prose, to the extent that the book's title seems like misinformation. Perhaps it should be called The Playwright and the Queen, and a small chapter of her life talking to an Ottoman Sultan. My next book is Sporus, Delicatus from Slave Boy to Empress in Imperial Rome. I learned about the story of Nero and Sporus, a Roman emperor who apparently murdered his wife in a drunken rage and then had a young man who looked like his wife castrated, and he married him, the boy replacing his wife. I found this story so strange and wild. Like, what was the context? Did they just grab this guy off the street and force him to live this life? Did he live like this against his will, or did he adopt the role successfully? Delicatus, which is historical fiction, does provide some context, like suggesting that Sporus was already a slave and his similarity in looks to the Empress had already been noticed by the higher-ups. But for a deep dive into the thoughts of the young slave that I was looking for, I was disappointed. For one, this is the first in a trilogy, and Sporus never becomes Nero's slave wife in this one. It feels like a prequel. Plus, I hate how this book is written. Listen, I love dialogue as much as the next person, but there's so little description of the world that the characters are in. Even when Sporus arrives at the capital, it's like the descriptions of Rome are just skipped over. This is supposed to be the greatest city in the world, and the dialogue itself sometimes has a pseudo-twang to it, but much of the time it feels like the characters talk way too modern. Sometimes I feel like the book was written as softcore gay porn, and had the story of Sporus written around it. I'm sure there would have been a lot of, nighttime activities in the poor man's life, but it's just endless. And like the lack of description, there's little about Sporus adjusting to his new life, him wrestling with the ideas of servitude and freedom, because the Sporus in this work doesn't remember his old life. There's an element of the book that comes off as too try-hard in terms of trying to be outrageous with the debauchery the characters are involved in, and at the same time trying to increase the shock level by having the stuff done so matter-of-factly. And there's also clanky morality comparisons the novel does, which I'm sure it feels clever for doing so, but it feels too simple and transparent. Like one part where some Christians are being killed in the arena by animals, and the Romans discuss the Christians refusing to accept the Romans as their deities and thus subjecting themselves and their children to the horrors of the Colosseum. And the characters remark something like, "What uncivilized barbarians," because of what the Christians did, while they're being ripped apart because of what the Romans have ordered. It's too obvious what the book is trying to do. Add the weird AI generated looking images spread throughout the novel. It just feels like an opportunity gone missed. I did not like it at all and rushed through it just to finish it. My last book on the list is The Ottomans, Khans, Caesars and Caliphs. Another Ottoman book here, this one written by Mark David Berer, which covers the entirety of the history of the empire. I'm about halfway through at the time of this video, so I think I can offer some thoughts which won't change unless the book takes a massive deviation in quality. Which, to be honest, could actually be possible, as many Ottoman historians have to be categorized into early Ottoman historians or late Ottoman historians. So I would say, as a piece of entertainment, The Ottomans was a great book. Fast-paced, well-written, and never dull, the book is exciting, teeming with colour. I've consumed so much on the Ottomans, and I was looking for a book that would interest me, and this one did. That being said, I do have a lot of issues with it. From a historical perspective, and I know there's a lot of back and forth when it comes to the Ottomans about what is true, what isn't, how something looks from one perspective versus how it looks from the other, but this work contains many of the same Western Orientalist trappings and tropes that I've noticed from many works written on the Ottomans in the English language. Eastern and Ottoman sources are dealt with using a pinch of salt and a cupful of doubt, whereas dubious sources that originate years after the fact but are Western sources are taken as fact. There's a lot of bizarre tendencies the author has that would mean I'd be wary of recommending this book to a novice of Ottoman history. It's entertaining, yes, but I think the author lets his goal of telling a good story get in the way of history. The book is probably best read the way I read it, already familiar with the Ottomans, going back to visit Turkey and just wanting to refresh myself on things before I go. With some of it, it's little things. Some sources state Mehmed the Conqueror was 19 when he took Constantinople. Some say he was 21. It's just something that I think a book like this should mention, as opposed to declaring he was 20 and not offering the other options. That's probably a good way to summarize it. The author has his opinions and he sticks to those. It's like, for example, practically every myth, legend and historical fact that we know about the founder of the empire, Osman, is dismissed as something made up by later Ottoman generations to venerate him and make him look good. Sure, I get that there's very little we actually know about him, but the author then states with utter conviction that Osman murdered his uncle with an arrow, and with no further explanation as to why this may have occurred. It's just a bit strange, really. Beyer has the narrative he wants to form, and he'll use whatever tools exist in the historical or mythical sphere to build it. He's coined this term, deviant dervish, in the book, and then magnetizes events around it. I think I've heard the phrase about 50 times now. I mean, the chapter on Bayezid the Thunderbolt was bizarre, and quite frankly, insulting for a student of history. It seems the author has decided what his character of Bayezid looks like, a partying drunk, and he will include or discard whatever he can to form and maintain this image. His many lightning-fast conquests, which is where he got the nickname from, are done over with in a single sentence, and one would really not get a sense of the importance of the Battle of Nicopolis from the book, nor Bayezid's rivalry with Tamerlane. He only mentions the Grand Mosque of Bursa once, and that is for ammunition in his argument that Bayezid was a drunk. Nothing about the famous story about promising to build 20 mosques which would become one mosque with 20 domes or anything. And the nail in the coffin to the book's credibility is Beyer recounting the idea that Tamerlane kept Bayezid in a cage and made the Sultan his footstool, a myth long since debunked, which originated from Western European sources who sought great pleasure in twisting the knife to Bayezid's ending as he was their enemy. Even if you don't want historical data to get in the way of a good story, at least offer different accounts of events. But that's what the book is, really. It's an entertaining romp, plucking from the adventures, the excitement, the allure of the Ottoman Empire. But it's not a book I look to with much historical reverence. So there you have it. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Let me know in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.